From the very first interactions, the United States government has sought to control and assimilate indigenous populations. Treaties, often broken, were used to seize land and resources. This displacement, coupled with forced relocation, devastated indigenous communities and their ways of life. The goal was clear: to erase indigenous cultures and replace them with the dominant Euro-American society. This policy of assimilation was pursued relentlessly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the most devastating policies was the Dawes Act of 1887. This act broke up communally held tribal lands into individual allotments. The aim was to force indigenous peoples to adopt European-style agriculture and land ownership. However, this ignored the cultural significance of communal land and traditional practices. The Dawes Act resulted in the loss of millions of acres of indigenous land, further impoverishing and disenfranchising these communities. The impact of these policies is still felt today. Generations of trauma, poverty, and cultural disruption continue to plague indigenous communities. The legacy of forced assimilation is a stark reminder of the dangers of cultural erasure and the importance of respecting indigenous sovereignty. The federal government did not act alone in its quest to assimilate indigenous populations. It found a willing partner in organized religion, particularly Protestant denominations. This collaboration gave rise to the Indian boarding school system, a network of institutions designed to strip indigenous children of their culture and language. From the late 19th to the mid-20th century, these schools became a central tool in the government's assimilationist agenda. Churches saw themselves as instruments of civilization, tasked with saving indigenous souls through conversion to Christianity. They believed that indigenous cultures were inferior and that assimilation into white society was the only path to salvation. The government, eager for a cost-effective way to manage indigenous populations, readily outsourced this task to religious institutions. This partnership, however, was built on a foundation of cultural superiority and a blatant disregard for indigenous beliefs and traditions. The consequences of this collaboration were devastating for generations of indigenous children. They were forcibly removed from their families and communities, stripped of their language, and subjected to physical, emotional, and often sexual abuse. Many children died in these schools, victims of neglect, disease, and despair. The trauma inflicted by the boarding school era continues to haunt indigenous communities today, contributing to social problems and a loss of cultural identity. The stated goal of many federal policies was to improve the lives of indigenous peoples. However, these policies were often implemented with a callous disregard for indigenous well-being. Corruption was rampant, with government officials and their cronies profiting from the exploitation of indigenous lands and resources. Treaties were routinely ignored, and indigenous voices were silenced. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, established to oversee the government's relationship with indigenous tribes, became a symbol of this corruption. Plagued by mismanagement, inefficiency, and outright theft, the BIA failed to adequately distribute resources or protect indigenous interests. The agency's actions often exacerbated the very problems it was meant to solve, deepening the cycle of poverty and dependence. This betrayal of trust has had a lasting impact on the relationship between the federal government and indigenous communities. It has fueled a deep-seated mistrust of government institutions and policies. Rebuilding this trust requires a commitment to transparency, accountability, and a genuine respect for indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. The forced removal of indigenous children from their families represents a particularly dark chapter in this history. Under the guise of providing them with a better life, children were taken from their homes and placed with white families or in boarding schools. This practice, which continued well into the 20th century, was tantamount to cultural genocide, aimed at severing the ties that bound indigenous children to their heritage and communities. The trauma inflicted by this forced separation is immeasurable. Many children never saw their families again, while others returned home deeply scarred by their experiences. The loss of language, culture, and connection to their communities has had a devastating impact on indigenous societies, contributing to social ills and a sense of cultural loss. The legacy of this trauma continues to reverberate through generations. It is a stark reminder of the human cost of assimilationist policies. and the importance of protecting the fundamental right of children to grow up within their own cultures and communities. Section 5. A shadowy persistence, modern echoes of a historical injustice. While the era of government-sanctioned boarding schools may be over, disturbing reports suggest that the trafficking of Indigenous children continues, albeit in a different form. In recent years, there have been allegations of a network of individuals and organizations exploiting legal loopholes to gain custody of Indigenous children for profit. This modern-day exploitation is fueled by a complex web of factors, including poverty, substance abuse, and a lack of access to adequate social services in many Indigenous communities. These vulnerabilities are compounded by a legal system that often fails to adequately protect the rights of Indigenous families. This disturbing trend underscores the urgent need for greater oversight and accountability within the foster care and adoption systems. It also highlights the ongoing vulnerability of Indigenous children and the need for proactive measures to address the root causes of this exploitation. Section 6. Unmasking the impostors. Fake courts and the exploitation of sovereignty. Adding another layer to this complex issue are reports of imposter tribal courts operating outside the bounds of legitimate tribal law. These courts, often established by non-natives, exploit the legal complexities surrounding tribal sovereignty to make a profit. They target vulnerable Indigenous families, often those struggling with addiction or poverty, and use intimidation tactics to gain custody of their children. These courts operate with little to no transparency or accountability. They often issue rulings that would never be recognized by legitimate tribal courts, further eroding trust in the legal system and exacerbating the trauma experienced by Indigenous families. This alarming trend highlights the need for greater awareness and education about tribal sovereignty and the dangers of these imposter courts. It also underscores the importance of supporting legitimate tribal justice systems and empowering them to protect their communities from exploitation. Section 7. Protecting the vulnerable, a call for vigilance and reform. The historical and ongoing exploitation of Indigenous children demands our attention and action. We must remain vigilant in identifying and addressing the systemic factors that contribute to this vulnerability. This includes addressing the legacy of trauma caused by assimilationist policies, providing adequate funding for social services in Indigenous communities, and reforming the foster care and adoption systems to prioritize the best interests of Indigenous children. We must also support the efforts of Indigenous communities to reclaim their sovereignty and protect their children. This includes respecting tribal jurisdiction over child welfare cases, providing resources to strengthen tribal courts and social service agencies, and working collaboratively to develop culturally appropriate solutions that address the unique challenges faced by Indigenous families. Section 8. Towards a brighter future. Acknowledging the past, shaping the present. The fight for justice and healing for Indigenous communities is far from over. It requires a collective effort to acknowledge the wrongs of the past, confront the injustices of the present, and work towards a future where Indigenous children are safe, families are respected, and cultures are celebrated. We must amplify Indigenous voices, listen to their stories, and support their leadership in the movement for change. By working together, we can create a future where Indigenous children are no longer seen as commodities to be exploited, but as cherished members of vibrant and resilient communities. Section 9. A shared responsibility amplifying Indigenous voices demanding justice. The responsibility to protect Indigenous children and uphold their rights falls on all of us. We must educate ourselves about the history of exploitation and the ongoing challenges faced by Indigenous communities. We must hold our elected officials accountable for enacting policies that prioritize the well-being of Indigenous children and families. By standing in solidarity with Indigenous communities, we can help create a world where all children are safe, respected, and free to embrace their heritage. Let us work together to ensure that the dark legacy of the past gives way to a brighter future for generations to come.